I am a 27-year-old male, living in North Texas where I was born. I am a very practical person, even though I was raised Christian. You know, the South. But I also believe in the existence of magic and the supernatural. I had grown up with ghosts and such in my home, and had a brief and terrifying experience with witchcraft, and even learned a form of martial art that incorporated principles of spiritual energy from a friend in high school who I'd seen perform inhuman acts of strength and speed. All my life, I have researched myths and histories of the supernatural from all over the world. By the time the new year rolled around, I had started dating my ex-girlfriend from high school. Jane and I had made plans to move into a new apartment with her and her 4-year-old son, Jonathan. It was a little rushed, but her lease was up, and she needed to get away from Jonathan's sociopathic and abusive father. I could go on about him, but it's irrelevant to the rest of the story, and honestly, he's not worth the words I've given him. What is relevant is the background of Jane and our history together. I was 6 foot, 250 pounds, and naturally strong, and what every parent wished for in their daughter's boyfriend. I was also totally clueless when it came to women. I had a lot of beautiful female friends who I'm now sure would have killed for a shot with me, and I even had crushes on a few of them, but had always assumed they would shoot me down. Jane was a year behind me, and had separate classes for students with mental illness that made it hard for them to be among the general class population. So it was pure chance when I met her in a pep rally. She usually wouldn't go to them, but it was required for her to attend such events at least once a semester in order to socialize in a way she normally wouldn't. I fell for her instantly, and after only 1 week of daily phone calls, she agreed to be my girlfriend, and I began spending every spare moment I could with her. I would run to her section of the campus between every class, just to spend less than a minute holding her hand or hugging her. I spent every weekend at her house, and of course, it was mostly in her bedroom. We would drive around the dark country roads at night and talk about our supernatural experiences, and I learnt about her unique family history. Generations ago in Wales, where her family originated from, one of her ancestors made a pact with a powerful fae. The fae are basically fairies and elves and such. They take many forms, and the different kinds have different powers and properties. The fairy promised her ancestors power, fortune, health, beauty, and intellect, not only for them, but for their descendants. But in exchange, the fairy and its descendants would exchange any of their own sickly young as a changeling for a healthy human child. The sickly fairy baby would appear to be normal, but would without fail succumb to severe illness quickly and die. Fairies, though, are not to be trusted, and in every historical account, every gift they offer would be tainted with something terrible. Information, she explained, that most of her family, at least those on her father's side, were indeed all of those things, but they were also mad. Members of her family that would seem to be blessed would often develop mental illness, and in some cases become suicidal. Her father, who had been a botanist and professor at the local community college, had become obsessed with research of plants that could, according to mythology, repel fairies and demons, but ultimately illegally purchased a firearm and shot himself in the head. In addition to this, her family did indeed have a high rate of infant deaths from otherwise treatable sicknesses or congenital defects without any explanation. All of this concerned me, as Jane had been honest about her mental condition. She had crippling anxiety and depression, as well as seeing a demon woman who called herself Georgia and told Jane that she was worthless and she should kill herself, which she had attempted before. I felt confident that, with my knowledge of the supernatural and my teenage ability to be immortal, sarcasm, and told her I would always be there for her and would never let anything happen to her. Our relationship continued to become more intense during the summer break, and there were very few days I did not spend with Jane either in my arms or at my side. There were so many that we would sit on the sofa with a movie or show play as her head rested on my lap and my fingers couldn't keep themselves out of her beautiful red hair. With all this extra time came more bad days too. Some days I would show up at her house and she would beg me to leave her because she didn't deserve to be happy, or I deserved better. There were others when things would be fine all day, until I noticed it was too warm for her to be wearing a sweater, and I would clean the bandages of her cuts. The worst days were the rare times that some chore or family event kept her. She would call my house endlessly all day until I came home to find messages filling the phone to the point it wouldn't record anymore. She insisted I had been avoiding her because I hated her, or that I had been with another girl. When I finally called, she would either be crying so much I couldn't understand, and I would immediately leave and walk to her house to comfort her and reassure her of my feelings for her, or she would be enraged to the point I didn't recognize her voice and tell me to leave her alone and then hang up. I had learnt to leave her alone, as she asked, but would call her mother just to check. It wasn't before long that the nightmares began. Every time she had a bad day, I would have the same vivid dream that night. When I say vivid, you need to understand most dreams that seem real when you're having them are still fuzzy around the edges and are obviously dreams. These were crisp, clear and perfect dreams, and I would wake up in my bed with the feeling of dread that only people who have thought they were going to die can understand, and my door would open. From the darkness of the hallway, the thing would call through to the top of my doorway on the ceiling. It was a young woman that looked exactly like Jane, except her skin was black scales, her eyes blood red from edge to edge, and elongated fingers ending in thin claws. She would crawl until she was directly above me and drop down on me, pinning me to the bed, the way an enthusiastic lover might. Her hands wrapped around my wrists and her hips situated on top of mine, as she would look at me like she either wanted to eat or rape me, maybe both. She would torment me and say terrible things about Jane, and that I should leave her and let the bitch kill herself. As I screamed internally, unable to make my body move after scratching and jabbing for what felt like hours, she would disappear, after whispering something like, "One day I'll be able to kill you." And I would wake up with aches and pains, but wrote it off as stress. Our relationship followed this pattern for almost 3 years. At the start of my senior year, I got a job and was doing extra schoolwork to make sure I would graduate. The less time I spent with her, the more I started to realize I couldn't do it anymore. She was getting worse, and I was falling apart. I felt that if I continued this way, things would get really bad. Halfway through the school year, I decided I just had to be honest with her. We met outside school at the end of the day, and I sat down at a picnic table. I knew I needed to be clear about what I was saying and stand my ground, no matter how emotional things got. So I told her I wasn't strong enough to hold her up, and that I needed to get out before it was too late. She took it really well. In fact, she didn't even seem fazed. I'm an idiot. She had blocked out everything I said. She told me she understood, and that it was okay to have a break from time to time, and that she would be there when I was ready. She stood up, kissed my forehead, and walked off, saying, "Gotta go, love you, honey." And that was before I could get a word out. The next week was hell. She would drive by my house and ask if I was home, and if my family said no or told her to leave, she would just glare and drive away without a word. Whenever I would coincidentally run into her, I would try to make her understand, which started her fighting and accusing me of cheating on her. Fast forward 2 weeks, and I'm at work, and had actually been hanging out with a female co-worker. But I wasn't ready to move any further yet. She was flirting with me as we worked the drive-through window together, and Jane walks into the door flinging it open, yelling at me in front of this girl, my boss, other co-workers, and a building full of customers. I walked away and asked my boss for an early break in order to deal with this. She told me it was fine, but if I didn't have her out in 10 minutes, she was calling the cops. I sat her down at the booth in the back, and as kindly as I could, told her that we were through, and that I couldn't be with her at all, and I wanted her to seek treatment, because I still loved her and was scared for her. I can't tell you the guilt in my heart when I watched her storm out. I had told her so many times that I would always be there, that I would solve all her problems, and she trusted me, but I had nothing left inside. It had been too much for an overworked teenager, but all I could think about was how I failed the girl I loved. I finished my shift that night, like an emotionless robot, and went home without another word. My brain screamed at me all night at how pathetic and shitty I was. I went straight to bed and cried myself to sleep like I'd never cried before. I woke up that night, feeling the same crushing fear as before, but didn't see anything. The door didn't open, and nothing crawled on my ceiling. I started to sit up, when it suddenly crept from the darkness and pinned me down again. It slapped me hard across the face and said, "You had this coming a long time. Now you die." I had began screaming and feebly thrashing about on my bed. The thing raised its hand and drew its fingers together, forming a claw into a single sharp spike. Just as it began to thrust its arm forward, my stepdad heard me calling and burst in to wake me from my nightmare. We sat in the kitchen for about an hour drinking coffee and talking about what I'd done and been through the day, and he had some great advice. But the whole time, I was distracted by the realization that he hadn't woke me up. The thing disappeared as he opened my door, and I was able to move again. And I'd been awake the entire time, and can only conclude that I was insane. I never told him the true nature of the incident, and when he left for work, I went back to bed but with the lights on. Over time, I never did recover and get over her, but never forgot what she still meant to me. Fast forward 8 years, and here we are living together, When we reconnected, she had told me that she had received treatment and counselling, and it had worked. Little did I know how good she was at faking sanity. When we moved in together, her belongings stacked halfway to the ceiling, and they filled the living room, which was quite large for an apartment, about 13 by 10 feet. But she assured me that they would be unpacked and put away soon. It started small at first. I would come home from working overtime 6 days a week, just so that we could afford the rent, to find out that her anxiety and depression had kept her bound to the bed. The apartment became worse the longer it went on, because she couldn't bring herself to clean up or do the dishes. I didn't blame her at first, but rather tidied up and got Jonathan and myself ready for bed. I began to bond with Jonathan throughout the time we were together, so much so that after a month he called me Daddy, and it was the most glorious feeling. I loved him more than I had ever loved anything in my entire life, and would have killed anyone who threatened him. Things continued this way for a while, until the stress of being overworked at my job and my home pushed things over the edge. I started to resent her for never once trying to overcome her illness, even though she admitted that she was seeing Georgia when I wasn't home. I was always supportive and even tried to get her to see a counselor again, but she never did. I started to blame her because she had the means to do better, but chose to give in to her illness because it was easier. That may have been the case, but I should have tried harder to get her to try, instead of saying all of the things to her face. We had begun fighting pretty regularly, and when I got home from work late at night, she would no longer be awake to greet me, but just go to bed and would simply clean up until about 2 a.m. and fall into my side of the bed and face the wall. There were good days too, when we would spend all our time together and enjoy every second of it. We would come home together in the evening and put Jonathan to bed together, and then spend the night in each other's arms. But it could not last forever. On the nights I would be cleaning up things, it started to become strange. I felt watched, and even hunted in my own apartment. I would see shadows darting in and out of corners, and after a few more weeks, I started to become angry all the time, and our fighting became more frequent, though, thank God, I never laid a hand on her. I even started having multiple panic attacks a day, and seeing the shadows at work and everywhere else. Eventually I stopped cleaning, and would simply come home late, because I had begun smoking again, and tried to hide it. I would walk around the block smoking, and then come home, take a shower, brush my teeth, and climb into bed. It was one of those nights when I woke in the middle of the night to see the goddamn lizard woman that I hadn't seen since before I graduated high school. It didn't crawl, but this time rather stood at the foot of my bed, and appeared to have changed somewhat. It was moments before I realized that it had grown and aged to resemble Jane, not as she was long ago, but as she was now, an adult. It seemed to be waiting for me to remember, and when it saw the recognition in my eyes, it grinned and leaned down to crawl all over my body. Now, we're almost done, so hang on, okay? I should mention at this point, I had dabbled a lot more in forms of magic and researched into demons and ghosts and other creatures, and what to do about them. The other thing is, I have no chill. To put it simply, when it comes to fight or flight, I am fight, and as I said, I'm 6 foot and 255 pounds, and I've only gotten stronger over the years, if not a little sore in the back and knees. What it must have failed to see in my eyes was rage. The thing was back and was threatening not one, but two people I loved. I began focusing energy in my body as she pinned me down and said, "Let's finish what we started, honey." I groaned back and said, "Bring it on, bitch," and it didn't seem to like me talking back. It raised its hand to strike me, and I pushed through the force holding me down and planted the fist of my non-dominant hand in its face, and channeled all the power I could muster into my hands. I reeled back, and I didn't let up, striking out again with my dominant hand, and followed through as though I was punching smoke. All of a sudden, I was punching smoke. It vanished as soon as I struck it a second time, and Jane had woken up. She was distraught and terrified, but strangely, she was also apologetic. After we calmed down, I asked her why she was apologizing, and she said, "It's my fault Georgia came for you. I can't stop her." I was in disbelief. How was this possible? How did I have an encounter with her delusion? She went to the closet and came back with a box. It was a box I recognized. It was her files from a mental institution from when she was 12. As part of her therapy, someone had asked her to draw Georgia, and she was a talented artist. Despite having the features of a young teenager, it was definitely the damned lizard bitch. I realized that I could not have known this. She never allowed me to see the contents of the box before, and I respected her rights to privacy. This meant that Georgia wasn't a delusion. She was a demonic entity that was likely bound to the Fae and their curse. Things got much worse in the following weeks, and I began to fall apart. I eventually came home hours later one night, and she had been waiting up and was freaking out. I told her I couldn't do it anymore. She refused to get the help she needed, and even used Georgia as an excuse, because she's real, which means that she isn't crazy. This of course disregarded her other excuse, but it somehow made sense to her. We talked for some time, as I packed my bags and kissed her goodnight. On my way out I said, "I never stopped loving you back then, and I never will." I had been staying at my mother's house for a few days, while she had arranged to move into a house her stepfather had purchased, as he's loaded. When she called me late one night, crying, she said that Georgia was trying to make her kill herself. She had cut a bit with a pair of scissors to make her go away, but it didn't work, and now she wanted to hurt Jonathan as well, and I was already in the car while I had my little brother on the phone with the police. She eventually hung up on me, and I stepped on the gas, and I made my way from the next county over, so fast that I arrived there at the same time as 2 police officers and a social worker. The next morning, she was in a hospital, and her mother was on her way from South Texas to pick up Jonathan. He and I cried as I put his car seat in his grandmother's car and buckled him in, and I never saw him again. When Jane got out of the hospital, I picked her up and we talked a lot. As we picked up her new meds, and I dropped her off at the apartment where her family was waiting, and already had her stuff moved out. It took a long time to get over it, and even now I have nightmares about horrible things happening to Jonathan. The last one was quite recent. I woke up and felt compelled to check the porch, where I found Jonathan's purple bloated corpse staring up at me from the doormat. I realize he isn't my biological son, but he will always be my child. The parents listening will understand how I feel, and if you don't, imagine the best moments with your children, the nights when they fall asleep before you can get them into bed, and you hold them in your arms, reveling in their purity, trying to memorize their scent. The first time they say, "I love you," and you feel as though you've been given a heavenly gift. Now imagine having them forcibly ripped from your arms and told they don't exist anymore. To make matters worse, I never saw Georgia again after that night, but I do have a demon of my own now. I began seeing that the day after the night, and it may look like me, but I don't know. He wears a black leather cloak with a large hood, and I can only see red piercing eyes. It has never said anything about suicide, but it does insult and degrade me, whilst trying to convince me to massacre random innocents. He says if I let him take control, I'll become powerful and have whatever I want. Jane, I doubt you're listening, but if you are, I changed some details to protect you and Jonathan, but I think you'll know. I'm sorry for my part in everything, and I'm working on a way of getting things figured out. If I'm ever successful, I'll find you and help you in a way I couldn't before, and possibly save Jonathan from the curse of your family in the process. My college required one gym class to graduate, but the classes they offered were actually pretty fun. So I took scuba diving. During my basic certification dive, my regulator started free flying. After diving in a 75-degree pool all semester, I was in a 40-degree lake for the actual dive, which added to the stress. We were trained in how to deal with a free flow, so I did what I was supposed to do. Unfortunately, I sucked water. That's really scary when you're 35 feet from the nearest breathable oxygen. And I panicked. I signaled the dive master, and we flew to the surface very quickly, with me using his secondary regulator. When I got up there, I was too freaked out. He had the presence of mind to reach between my flailing arms to inflate my BCD, and likely saved my life. That at least kept me on the surface of the water. When it was all said and done, I couldn't put my face underwater without having a panic attack. I went on to eventually get my advanced open water diving certification, but the first couple of dives after that first incident were incredibly tough to do. This reminds me of an experience I had in Bali with unregulated underwater activities. Our first activity was the underwater walking. We had all got in a little speedboat and then took a short 5-minute trip out to another boat that had all the equipment. The activity was similar to that time I did snuba in the Caribbean, in that the oxygen tanks were up on the surface of the water. Instead of having a scuba mask to breathe out of though, we had this very heavy helmet. And it was placed on our heads as well as rubber shoes so that our feet wouldn't be mutilated by the coral. I went first, and the procedure was very simple. I just went on a ladder with most of my body in the water. They placed a rubber circle on my head to cushion my shoulders and make a seal with my helmet, I presume. And then they put the helmet on. The second that it was on my body, I felt its weight forcing me to the bottom of the ocean. It was kind of scary because I went down pretty fast, which caused the pressure to build up very quickly. I made sure to swallow and yawn a bunch, and I was fine. Also, I could never really get a deep breath of air, because as I breathed in, the helmet began to make a vacuum, and I would have to stop to let it fill with more air. My other friends followed suit, and then a scuba diving man came down to be our guide. He handed all of us a piece of bread in a plastic bag, which drew all the fish out to us. It was fun to see. There were metal guiding handrails on the ocean floor, which I followed, with my friends right behind me. It was very difficult to walk, because the current was surprisingly strong, and the helmets were quite heavy. We all enjoyed it though. As I breathed, there was a constant loud sound, as water whined in through the tube. It was kind of annoying, but it meant that I was getting air, which is very good. That's why it was so scary when the sound suddenly stopped. I was confused, but it quickly came back on after about 4 seconds, and I could breathe again. I rationalized it by assuming that my tank had run empty, and that they were switching it to a different one. No big deal. I didn't understand how they would run out of air so quickly, but I didn't think too hard about it. No big deal. It came back on, and I could breathe again. After about 10 minutes, the guide points to me and indicates that he wants me to climb over the railing. I was very confused, but I did it after he made it very clear that that was what he wanted. It was kind of hard to see any peripherals out of the mask, so it was easy to get lost. I looked behind me to make sure I saw where my friends were, in order for us not to get lost. We made eye contact, so I assumed we were all good, and then turned back around to follow the guide. He had me waiting in a very small path between two corals, so I went very slowly to make sure that I didn't cut my legs up on any of them. It was hard due to the strong underwater current, my unwieldy helmet, and an occasional tug by the air tube as I pulled it. As I reached the guide, my air stopped again. I figured it was no big deal, like the previous 2 times, and continued on. I followed him a bit, and it still didn't come on. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. I was starting to get confused. Was this some kind of joke? If so, it wasn't funny at all. 15 seconds. I thought to myself, don't panic. They always tell you not to panic. I panicked. I started taking quicker and quicker breaths, but I forced myself to stop that. I knew that was the worst thing I could do. I spun around to the guide, then started pounding my fist on my chest. That was the sign for I can't breathe. He seemed to notice and started walking away. I thought maybe I should just try and shrug off the helmet and swim to the surface. I didn't even know if I had enough air to make it though. I didn't know if the boat was above me, and I didn't want to hit my head. I didn't know if I could actually shrug it off, and I didn't want to get the bends. So I figured it wouldn't be a good idea. After 30 seconds, I started to notice that I was getting less and less oxygen with each breath. Water was starting to fill my helmet, and I had to look up to breathe what little air I had. I grabbed hold of the guy's arm so that I wouldn't lose him, and also so that he would understand the gravity of the situation. I gave him quite the death grip. 40 seconds. And I saw the ladder of the boat. I knew that all I had to do was make it there and I would be okay. I must have gotten some sort of adrenaline rush, with a renewed hope, because I almost forgot about my lack of air. I fumbled for the ladder for a few seconds, and it was hard to tell distances through the helmet, because it had a bit of a magnifying aspect to it, before I grabbed it and started pulling myself up. As I broke the surface, air came rushing into my helmet, and I took a nice deep breath. Breathing had never felt better. That was definitely the scariest experience of my life, and would never recommend it to anyone. I was driving a truck and trailer up what was a little more than a dirt road, coming out of Lithgow in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales. The road wound its way past the State Mine Museum and off deeper into the backcountry to an area that has a managed forest. So one side of the road is just a dense Aussie bush, and the other side was row upon row of managed forest. Creepy as hell even in the daytime. I had delivered the small bulldozer on the truck to a logging site and was on my way back towards Lithgow when I ran out of driving hours, so I pulled over for a nap. It would have been around 1 or 2 in the morning when I woke up, and dragged my sorry arse into the driver's seat to fill my logbook. I had left the interior light off because it was a full moon, and there was more than enough light to work with. As I was filling in my log, I noticed a man coming out of the mangled forest on the opposite side of the road, maybe 100 meters further down. I figured if he needed help, he would come over to the truck, and I went back to resume my paperwork. You know that feeling you get when something is not right, and the hair stands up on the back of your neck? I got that. Upon looking up again, I noticed the man was right in front of my truck, probably only a few feet away. But what struck me was the size. To put into context, I had the perfect size reference. The hood of my truck is about 6 foot 6 inches off the ground, and it barely came up to this thing's chest. It seemed curious about what this massive thing was doing in its territory, and was peering straight at me through the windshield. I had one of those fight or flight moments, and instead of sitting still, I slammed on the starter button and hit every light the truck had. High beams, spotlights, everything. The old Mac was air start, so it screamed like a banshee and then roared as I started revving it to get it back in the air so that I can get the brakes and leave. The creature did the most human-like thing I've ever seen. It stepped back from this roaring thing and raised its hand. And it was a hand, up to shield its eyes from the lights. Its eyes glowed red, like a cat's do when you hit them with light, and it took off into the scrub on the side of the road. I got the hell out of there, and didn't even bother with a walk-around inspection, because there was no damn way I was getting out of that truck until I got back to the lights of town. I've been back there once since then. A couple of friends and I were down that way, and we drove up that road to have a poke around, look at the ruins of the mining industry, and that sort of thing. And I still felt uneasy about being there, but thankfully, I didn't see the Yowie creature again. I am a dive instructor, and I certify people at the Ginny Springs. I was there the day before the students were going to show up, and decided to do a drift dive to look for GoPros or hidden treasures at the bottom of the river. I've done it hundreds of times and never ran into any issues, but this dive, Judy went south. I was diving a backplate and wing sail with an 80. Drift diving with 3 other instructors and helpers. Start the drift dive and head straight to the deepest part of the river, which was about 25 feet. It had also been raining really badly, so visibility was about 6 inches with a 300 lumen light. Worst I've had. So I had my face on the bottom searching for stuff. About 15 minutes into the dive, I just stop. I figured I just ran into a log. I can't see shit. So I back up, and something moves across my back. I'm like, what the hell? What was that? So I spin quickly, and my leg rips out my mouth, and I drop my dive light. It's attached to my wrist, but I can't get the light back. It's caught on something. So I use my left hand to grab my octo from my clip around my neck, but it's not there. I'm not really worried, just really confused, and I can't see shit. So I decide to just go up. In 35 feet of water, no problem. Except I can't get my left arm free. That's when something hits me between the neck and first stage. Worst thing pops into my head. It's a gator. So I'm like, shit, I gotta get away from it. And I just spaz out trying to get free, and finally do. I swim to the surface, scared to death of what just happened, and regain my composure. I had no idea what happened, so I go back down to investigate. I had swam between a log on the bottom and gotten stuck in the chaos, and I managed to wrap my light around the branch on the log and just about killed myself because I didn't stay calm and thought it was a gator attack. The whole ordeal took less than a minute, but it felt like eternity. I went for my first dive on holidays. It wasn't very deep, and I was tethered to the instructor. We were down for a couple of meters, and I was about 15 years old. I loved swimming and general adventure, so I was loving it. When we went back to the surface, and I asked if we could go any deeper, I was told the weather was going to get worse. That's why we came up, and didn't go very deep to begin with. We went home and was talking to my friend, and one of their dads said, "But aren't you asthmatic?" And I was like, "Yeah, but it doesn't really affect me." And he basically told me if I had gone for a proper dive, I could have had an asthma attack and died underwater, as of course I wouldn't have had an inhaler available. I was cutting an 8-inch pipe with a reciprocating hydraulic saw in about 30 feet of water. The guy before me cut all but the last few inches of the pipe and called it a day. I had never cut a pipe before. Before I got in though, I asked the previous guy what was up. He told me to stand on top of the pipe and push the saw down in the cut with one foot, while holding onto the crane straps that were attached to either side of the cut. I jumped in, got down to the cut and started to saw. I had my face real close to the pipe, because visibility was only a few inches. When I was going to make a few strokes to make sure the saw was lined up, then I climbed on top, and after about 20 seconds of cutting, the pipe snapped, and it hit me in the face. Well, in the faceplate. It put a nice nick in the face ring, and knocked me back a few feet. The thing is, if anything had been behind me, I would have been crushed, which is something horrifying to think about. This happened when I was 17. I'm 32 now. I graduated high school and got my first apartment in a nice town. I lived by myself and my cat, Snowball. Don't laugh. I named her when I was 8 years old. Here are a few details before we get started. I've never been a fan of cat boxes. Worst part of being a cat owner is shoveling tiny shit with a tiny shovel every day. So I got one of those motion-activated, self-scooping deals. Let it on the back patio, ran the cord inside to power it, and left the back sliding door open big enough for her to get in and out of. The patio is one of those 8x8 cement floored types surrounded by a 5-foot tall wooden fence. If you looked out of my bedroom door, you'd be facing right at the sliding door with hanging blinds, living room in between, and a kitchen that's far off to the right. So I'm playing some 56k Counter-Strike at the computer in my room, with my back facing the door. It's around midnight, and I hear Snowball start to make one of those awful cat growling noises in the back of her throat. I'm pretty locked onto the game, so I tell her to knock it off, while not looking at her. She keeps doing it, and I tell her to shut up. I'm irritated, because I'm doing well in the round. She gets louder. This is enough to break me from my gaming zone, and I realize this is not normal. I get up from my computer to see her standing in the doorway facing out, her back to me. She is on full Halloween cat mode, hair sticking straight out, her back is completely arched, and she looks tense. I'd never seen her that way. She is still just looking crazy. I look out the living room window where she's facing. Nothing is amiss. There's nothing there. I look down at her to say something to the effect of, "What's the matter?" And she makes this insane sound, like a combination of a hiss and a growl and a spit, as she starts to take a few steps back. This is when a tiny creature runs out of the kitchen on 2 legs, wearing a tattered piece of cloth or a bag. It looked like a little cloak, and it was about 1 foot or 1.5 feet tall. It is a real-life jump scare. The cat jumps backwards about 3 feet in the air, and I jump. I glance down at her as she does, but this thing quickly looks back up. I hear her land with a crash behind me, and run. I'm fixated on the thing. It's moving, but it's like time has slowed down. Now I'm watching these things happen, but everything is so fast. It runs out of the back door, through the blinds, with a crash at high speed that doesn't seem natural. The blinds are swinging, my heart is pounding, and I stand there dumbfounded. What the hell did I just see? I'm staring at the back patio door and at the swinging blinds. I'm not moving. My eyes start to notice that something is wrong. All the blinds are softly swinging, except the 2 closest to the opening. I see they're making an inverted V. I look at them and follow them down to the very bottom, and in between them I see it. Its head is poking through the blinds, staring at me. It has yellow eyes and a face that I can only describe as bestial. Grey, greenish, blackish skin. At this point, a singular loud thought fills my mind. You aren't supposed to see this. And, at the conclusion of that, every one of my hanging blinds shoots upwards and outwards. I jump again, and my heart tries to blast out of my chest. Some of them hitting the ceiling, a few fall off. It is a loud racket, and the rest are swinging all over the place. I look at the place where its face was, and it was gone. I beeline for the kitchen. Refrigerator door is open, and I open a drawer and grab the biggest knife I see. I'm shaking. Adrenaline, like I have never experienced before. I rush to the sliding door and slam it shut, and it won't close. I open it a bit more and slam it back again, and it still won't close. I am completely stupid. The cat box cord. I crouch down, brandishing this knife like a complete idiot, looking out at the glass door, waiting for this thing to launch at my face. I'm shaking. I reach across myself with my left hand to the power plug on the wall, to the right as I stare out. waiting to stab anything that approaches. I fumble to get it unplugged. My hands won't do anything right. I finally get the cord unplugged, and I open the door really quick to throw the cord outside. I throw it like a spaz, and it hits the wall on the side of the door and falls down. Still inside. Shit. I pick it up and try again, and this time it lands outside. I hear a scratching sound, and my eyes dart up. I see two tiny, awful hands holding onto the fence. Clawed, gnarly, humanoid hands. The thing climbed down feet first, hanging from the fence. It would have been slightly comical if it wasn't so bloody terrifying. The hands let go, and I hear it land in the bushes outside the fence, and I hear the fast footsteps as it runs off. I slam the door shut and lock it. This is completely true. I've heard it all. It was a raccoon. It was a cat that managed to get trapped in a paper bag. And it was not either of those things. After the event, I started researching like a madman. Closest thing I found was in a book I found in the library called The Fairies, which is like an art form featuring all different types of Irish folk creatures. I don't live in Ireland. I live in the US on the West Coast. You don't believe this story, and I don't blame you. It sounds ridiculous. You probably shouldn't believe it. I absolutely hate no sleep. I think it's stupid. I hate bullshit paranormal stories. Believe it or not, I am a skeptic. I believe all people that have experienced something strange or believe in the paranormal should be skeptic. I enjoy debunking paranormal videos and pictures. I want the truth. Was I hallucinating? It's entirely possible that I had an extreme and sudden hallucination. It's not unheard of. But that doesn't account for my cat freaking out and reacting at all the appropriate moments. So, there's that. This event had a huge impact on my life and completely affected the way I view the world. The paranormal, religion, everything. I have a story that happened to me and my friend. To set the scene, we were on a Boy Scout / camping trip. There were 20 or 30 of us, and we were in a little cabin thing with windows on the front and back, and a front and back door. There were little wooden tables all around the area. The adult cabin, with the bathroom, was about 1/8 of a mile down a gravel road in the dark. There was obviously a buddy system, because it's Boy Scouts. So it's around midnight, and everyone has been telling scary, boring scary stories anyway, like normal camping trips. Well, I had to go to the bathroom, and asked my friend to come along. He said sure, and he got our knives. We knew that there would be bears in the woods, and it made us feel safer. Well, we went to the bathroom and began our walk back. This is where it got scary. I felt an instinctual fear. I looked to my friend, and he has the same look as me. We begin to walk a little faster and unfold our pocket knives. I then turn around and see it. It looked similar to a cat, but it was 6 feet tall and was on its hind legs and kind of hunched over. I freaked the heck out and started running. My friend sees it too, and we sprint back to the cabin. It began making a moaning and howling noise, and it was somewhere in between the two, and followed us, slowly. We pound on the door, and the guys let us in. We tell them what we saw, and they actually believe us. So we lock the front door, and look at the back door. It had no lock. We pushed a table up against it, and had a kid there with his knife for safety. We drew the blinds on all the windows that had them, as one of them didn't, and we sat there with all the lights on. Then we see the eyes outside the windows without blinds. We were all shitting ourselves, and the thing slowly walked to the back door. We heard it bump up against it, maybe trying to open it, we think. It then left, but we still thought we were going to die. No one slept. When the adults came to wake us up, we told them, and they laughed and said that we were making it up. We know it happened, even if they didn't believe us. I was doing a live abroad off the coast of the Cocos Island, which is part of Costa Rica, with my dad and brother about 6 years ago. I was about 20 and had been certified since the age of 16. So, although still relatively new, I had some decent experience. So one morning, we were heading to a dive location, and the weather and water is fairly rough going. I didn't think much of it, because things still tend to be a bit calmer below, but this was not the case. A group of us, about a dozen divers, and the dive master, all enter the water and proceed to descend using a guideline. Visibility was poor, but still wasn't bad, and the current was incredibly strong. You would literally be moved 15 to 20 feet in one direction, and going against the current was nigh impossible. So at the bottom, at around 80 feet, diving with my dad and brother, I kept a constant eye on my dive computer. I know the threshold for what's safe, and when to start to head to the surface. But with the current, the dive master wanted everyone to descend and ascend on the guideline around the same time. I see my air starting to get low, and I knew that I had burned through it quickly, due to the strain of the current. So I signal my dad what my air level is at, and that I think we should head up. Luckily, the group was all filing in line on the guideline and proceeded to slowly ascend to do their safety stops. At this point I was relatively calm, but as I realized I was one of the last divers in line to go up, I started to get worried about air. Well, to speed up the story, I ran out of air at around 80 feet in strong current, and had to buddy breath with my twin brother on the way up. In retrospect, although running out of air is never good, I was still not in too life-threatening of a situation, as there were plenty of divers to share air with just in case anything went wrong. But the whole situation still shook me up, as it probably would most people. When I got back to the main boat, I pretty much broke down, and other than taking a quick dive the next day to see if my nerves could handle it, I've never been since. I, however, told my dad recently I might want to take it up again, and not let this incident ruin diving for me. For some, sharks are their fear about diving. For others, it's drowning. But for me, it would have been running out of air and being unable to avoid my certain death on the sea floor. I'm sharing this story in memory of my late father. My dad grew up in southern Florida. He became certified at a young age and specialized in cave diving. In fact, he mapped some of the underwater caves for local organizations and governments. In his 20s, his good friend got married to a woman who happened to love diving just as much as my dad and his friend. One day, the friend's wife decides to go for a dive in one of the more complex caves they'd been to. The wife and the other person she was diving with get lost in the cave, and unfortunately, never make it back up. When she never made it back home, my dad's friend goes to the cave and dives in looking for her. I think it was just by himself, but I'm not sure since my dad never spoke about it too much. Going solo is dumb, but I take it the guy was just upset about his wife. Unfortunately, my dad's friend never made it back either. So now, with 3 bodies in the cave, the local police discuss the situation with my dad, and eventually, he goes down into the cave to recover all 3 bodies. He sometimes did cadaver dives for them in the past, I believe, and I can only imagine seeing 3 of your closest friends dead in a very complex cave network, deep underwater. It no doubt was absolutely horrific, and I think my dad quit diving after this, as he never took me before he passed away. I was doing lionfish research in the TCI, where we would go to different depths and measure lionfish population sizes, size and habit preferences. We had a few close encounters with stubborn lionfish under massive coral mounds, but the scariest experience came from my dive master. Because of the nature of our research, we did transects in one direction, so our boat would do a live pickup wherever we ended up. The boat would know our location, and we would send a safety sausage, which is an inflatable marker that looks like a mini flip-floppy tube that you'd see as a car dealership sale, and then ascend. As we neared the end of one of our 100-foot dives, I noticed my dive partner acting funky. Definitely the onset of becoming sufficiently numbed. I'm watching out for her and trying to ensure that she doesn't get too close to the lionfish, while my dive master gets out the safety sausage to send up to the surface. As my dive master blew up the safety sausage, the weighted component of the line that let the safety sausage catapult to the surface while staying anchored at whatever depth we were at, bounced off something, knocked her goggles and snorkel off, and wrapped itself around her arm. The safety sausage catapulted up, pulling up my dive master. Luckily, I quickly reacted, grabbed her ankle, and she shot upwards. We yanked her down and flipped her around, and started swimming as hard as we could downwards. That gave her about 10 seconds, as it still pulled us upwards for her to wriggle her arm out of the line and free herself. I pulled her back down to the sea floor, and she cleared her mask and just sat there heaving for a few minutes. Meanwhile, I looked over and see that somehow my knocked partner had the dive master's lost snorkel in her hands. My knocked research partner still believes to this day that she played an essential role in saving the dive master's life. My friend and I were driving up to a friend's camp in Mesa Verde, Colorado. We're driving up and we go through this tunnel that has an urban legend of it being haunted. They say, if you stop in the middle of the tunnel, you will see something come out of the shadows. Stand in the middle of the road and stare. As you can imagine with all urban legends, my friend and I didn't believe this shit for a second. We're going through the tunnel having a good time, and we're making fun of the urban legend, saying skinwalkers are nothing but old Indian tales. We were coming out of the other end, when something runs out in front of us, and I have to slam on the brakes. I drive a Honda Civic, so my car is pretty low to the ground, but I swear that the creature's back was as tall as my windshield. It had tanned, rough skin, not hair, skin. It stops, looks at us for roughly 15 seconds, then nonchalantly strolls to the other side of the road, where there's another creature watching, waiting for it to come to the other side. As soon as it's on the other side of the road, I hightail it up the mountain, trying to get to our friend's camp as soon as possible. My mind was so scared, I hardly got to see details, but my friend was bawling, saying it spoke to her through her eyes. She said it had a human-dog hybrid face, and it told her that it shouldn't make fun of things that she didn't understand. I'm trying to calm her down, thinking she's just freaked herself out. As I'm driving, I'm looking at the sides of the road, where I see these small creatures staring at us through the grass. They're not moving or anything, just watching. At this point, I'm starting to freak out. We get to our friend's camp, and he has a camper. Thank God I was not sleeping in a tent after all that shit. We start drinking, and eventually forget what just happened. We're all cleaning up, getting ready for bed, when we hear the loudest scream we've ever heard. It was so loud and long, I had to cover my ears. It was like a banshee getting murdered. It was the worst sound I'd ever heard in my life. We are all in the bedroom, too afraid to be by ourselves, when we hear sniffing around the camper, like a dog does when he's sniffing something out. We heard this noise for 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. We eventually got so exhausted that we passed out. The morning that we woke up, we remembered what happened and packed up all of our shit in about 10 minutes. He got his camper hooked up in 5, and it was honestly the scariest thing I had ever experienced, and I will never be visiting again, even at daytime. Don't speak upon things that you do not understand, because there's always a possibility that it exists. I had a dive buddy go out of air on me, on a wreck in the St. Lawrence. Thankfully, this was a no-deco dive, under 100 meters of water, and we weren't actually inside the wreck. But the part that made it challenging was that the wreck was right in the middle of the shipping lane, where really large freighters travel, with really high current. So we couldn't just make an easy ascent to the surface. We had to navigate along a series of lines, pretty thick rope tied off on some good anchor points, that had been laid out to give divers something to hang on to if they could pull themselves against the current onto the path of the wreck and stabilize themselves during the swim back to the anchor line. We were making our exit, and everything was going fine. He was on my long 7-inch hose out in front, and I had a hand on his knees, so we were keeping in good contact. Then, for one moment, I let go of his knee to deal with some gear, and in that split second, he came off the line and got caught in the current, ripping my regulator out of his mouth in the process. I saw him manage to grab hold of another of the lines downstream, and he was hanging on for dear life, completely inverted in a shipping lane, with no regulator in his mouth and no gas in his tank, flapping in the current like a flag in the wind. I bolted towards him as quickly as I could, while still managing to keep my own safety, and gathering up the 7 inches of abandoned hose and regulator along the way. I caught him and managed to get the regulator back in his mouth, but since he was inverted, it went in upside down and as a result didn't breathe like it should. He fixed that himself, but slipped off the line that he was holding onto in the process. I managed to get a hold of him, but not without having to let go of the line myself. I ended up hooking both of my feet around the line to keep us both in place. Somehow I managed to pull us both back down to where we could grab hold of the line. It was at this point that another diver in our group saw what was going on and assisted, and from there we were able to get back to the boat without any further incidents. In 2010, me and two friends were driving around out of the country in Effingham, Illinois. We live about 30 minutes away from there. This was a typical weekday night, driving out to a cemetery to respectfully explore. We were told the Caspar Cemetery, deep in the woods, surrounded by caves outside of Effingham, was a really good place. We head to Effingham and stop for sodas at a gas station, and then head to the country. It's about 1 or 2 a.m, so it's dark, and I see something with yellow glowing eyes off the side of the country road, just past the ditch, in the headlights. It was too short to be a deer, but too big to be an opossum or a raccoon. As we get closer, it gets clearer, and I realize that what I am looking at is a skinny, hairless, and grey human-like thing, but definitely not human. Crazy as hell looking. It was crouched. Its arms were incredibly long, and looked like it could have been 7 feet tall, or perhaps more, while standing. I could feel myself. My heart got cold, and it began to race as the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had no idea what I was staring at, but I was feeling the most pure and rawest fear I had ever felt. I was just taking in the situation, and kind of whispered to myself, "What the hell?" And then I heard my friend Harley in the back seat shout, "What the hell is that?" Complete shock and terror set in, and I can't make a sound. I'm just staring at it. By the time we are right in front of it, passing it, it just watches us drive by, and it sinks back into the darkness from whence it came. Then we all start screaming, literally freaking the hell out. I was convinced it was a demon for months, but still doubted myself seeing it, thinking that my mind had played a trick on me. We didn't even make it to the Caspar that night. We went straight home, and I couldn't sleep. 6 months later, I'm at a different friend's house, and she gets a text from her cousin. She sends me this strange picture of a creature, and the hairs on the back of my neck stand up straight, and I went cold. I was seeing this thing again. I knew we weren't crazy, that there was something to this. He said he caught it on his trail camera one town over. He told us later it wasn't his camera, but that he was just pranking us. But nonetheless, I immediately recognized it. I asked her to send me the picture, and I sent it to Harley, and he quickly replies, recognizing the thing that we saw that night. After a while of investigation, I found out that the picture was faked, but still can't help but have my doubts. I researched the pictures of demons to try and find some answer, and nothing. Fast forward to October 2012, and I'm on Facebook, and I come across a page called Weird Effingham, Illinois. So of course I start combing through the entire page, and I find reports of sightings around the cemetery of creatures with glowing eyes. Nothing as in-depth as what I saw, but still enough to tell me that we were not the only ones who must have seen something out there. I researched demons and paranormal stuff for some time, but found nothing. 2 years after that, I'm scrolling through my Facebook feed again, and then comes the infamous faked picture. One girl I know posted it on the wall of another girl, so I immediately commented my story on it. When I got up to the previous comments, I see one of the girls were talking about seeing it as well. She replied to my comment and told me that she had seen it in the country in Effingham too, back in 2011. This guy we went to school with commented on the status too, and said that he had a friend that was super into the occult, and that she said they're called ghouls. So I went right into researching ghouls. What I found blows my freaking mind. Lore says they are cave dwellers, and, as I previously mentioned, Caspar Cemetery is surrounded by caves. They feed on the freshly dead, and normally stay close to cemeteries to be within close proximity of their food source. They've been known to show themselves to humans when trying to get close to them to eat them, when freshly deceased bodies are scarce. I went to images, and I could only find some illustrations, but they look exactly like what I saw that night. Everything I was reading was falling perfectly into place, and lined up perfectly with my experience. I couldn't explain it away. Then last night, I came across a Reddit post with a similar story to mine, in such detail. This is one of the most incredible things that has ever happened to me, and I will always search for more answers. I was on my first real dive after getting certified. My cousin drove me to Monterrey, and we drove to the same beach where I got certified. 5 to 10 minutes into the dive, we're greeted by a couple of sea otters. We're right next to a jetty, so I move closer in and attempt to stay stationary, so I can just sit and watch the sea otters. My cousin has been right above me the whole time, so when I feel a poke and pinch on my armpit, I think it's just him or his flipper hitting me. I turn around and see that he's still above me. Adrenaline kicks in as the pinch has become stronger, and I can see what's touching me. I spit out my regulator and tore off my mask in a panic when the pinch started hurting. I tried spinning around, but I was just moving into an incoming wave, and it felt like I was being held back. My cousin jammed his regulator into my mouth and turned me around again. I thought he was trying to hug me. He had his arms around me and then let go. He grabbed my regulator and his own and then swapped them. Then he turned me around again, and a giant spider crab was retreating into a crevice, into its boulders behind me. My cousin had said it had at least 2 claws on me when he saw me pulling my mask off. He told me he understood my panic, but he never took me diving again, and I've never wanted to since. I was snorkeling in open blue water, 200 yards off a reef wall with a pod of dolphins. I noticed what I thought was a grey reef shark about 60 feet below me, which I'm perfectly comfortable around. It started swimming upwards in circles towards me. At first, I thought to myself, wow, that's a larger reef shark. But as it continued ascending to about 30 feet below me, I instantly recognized the round, flat snout and striped pattern on its back. My heart rate quickened and breathing increased, as I realized it was a 12-foot tiger shark that was curious about me and continued ascending in a wide spiral at me. I immediately attempted to hail my boat captain, who was 150 yards off, using the shark and "come get me" hand signals. But he thought I was just waving and having fun watching dolphins that were no longer within my view. In the back of my mind, I thought that worst case scenario, maybe the dolphins will come and save me. As my boat captain was unresponsive and the level of risk was exaggerated in my mind since I'd never seen a tiger shark, I realized I would have to swim to the boat. Swimming freestyle with fins. I would take a few strokes and look back down to keep my eye on the shark. After doing this 3 or 4 times, the shark had reached the surface and was swimming parallel with me, towards the boat, about 20 inches to my right. I even saw its dorsal fin breach the water. Then, as a result of the moderate chop, I lost sight of the fish. Not knowing where it was freaked me out even more, and I broke into a full sprint towards the boat, no longer trying to keep my eyes peeled for it. I didn't wait for the captain to put the ladder down, and just hurled myself over the freeboard, nearly out of breath, and I didn't see the shark again. I lost a lot of time once. It's one of a few very creepy things to happen to me, but this one really got to me, and still does. It only happened a few months ago. I went for a walk with my mother on a local path, around a fairly large hill, a regular pastime of ours. We walked the 2 miles from the car to the hill before beginning our ascent to reach the loop, which is only about a half-mile encircling the peak. We're from the area and have always known that people have become wildly lost up there, even though the path is the only one around the hill. It's sort of very specific knowledge. If you go 10 miles away, no one will know about it. We had been dozens of times before, with the dogs usually, but today it was just my mum and I. We had never been lost before. So, we'd been walking for I don't know how long, when I noticed something odd. The sun was in the same place to us as it had been for however long we'd been walking, on a circular path. It should have appeared to have moved as we changed directions. We should have also been reaching the point where you headed down the hill, but our path was completely level. I was taught to use the sun and other natural signs to navigate, as I spend a lot of time just wandering, whether on horseback or on foot. At that point I realized I had no recollection of that part of the path, and had been walking along in silence. Well, here's the weird bit. Out came my phone, and it showed me the time was 2:37. I had absolutely no signal, even though it's usually spot on up there. We had set off at 11 in the morning, and all the hairs on my body stood up. This was a short walk, an hour and a half at most, and leaving the car and getting back to it included. The sun should have been above us, but it was sat off to where it would have said 3 o'clock for that time of year. I remember the time, because when I turned to ask my mum what time she had, she looked straight through me like I wasn't there, and remained like that for a whole 3 minutes. She was just staring off into space, and to her left. Then at 2:40 she suddenly came to life. I had moved away at that point, too nervous to remain under her gaze like that. After about a minute of saying, "Mum," and nudging her in the rigid shoulder, in a building childlike panic, even though I was 20. I sat on a log just off the path, getting pretty freaked out. My mum glanced around and said in a hollow, weird voice, "I think the fairies might have us. We need to keep walking." I scrambled up and fell in to match her determined strides on this unfamiliar path. Why fairies, Mum? Why say that? I wasn't raised to see them as little cutesy people with wings, you see. To me, they're straight out of nightmares, because my mother's upbringing said that's what they were. Creatures out to confuse and trick. What time does your watch say, Mum? She always wears a battery-operated analog watch, and she lifts up her wrist. 2:45. She puts her wrist down and lifted it up again to check. That's not right. I just shook my head. All right, keep walking. So we did. We trudged on through this unfamiliar woodland for what I would have said felt like half an hour. It never turned a corner or changed elevation. I knew we were in bother when my stalwart, never frightened of anything mother, began to get nervous. So in response to her nerves, she became pissed off. She steeled herself, lifted those proud, all-seeing gypsy eyes to the creepy atmosphere, and spoke as she would to a lurking person. "Who's toying with us? Put us back!" There was what I can only describe as a burst of deep laughter from the path behind us, and we spun around to face it. We were at the top of a hill that led to the gate out of there. It was at the fork where you can go either left or right, neither of which I remember choosing, even though we always made a decision of it. We made our own way down the slope and out of the woods as calmly as possible, and got back to the car, which was parked next to an ancient church cemetery. The time in the car? 5:12. We should have got back to the car no later than maybe 1:45 if the walk had gone normally, or just after 4 when our watch and phones said we were approaching 3. We lost nearly 5 hours. I've had a lot of creepy stuff happen to me, but this is about the worst. I wasn't alone. It was the middle of the day on a usually familiar path. Where did those hours go? Where was that path? So many unanswerable questions. I even went up there one day alone just to see if I could experience it again, but nothing happened. I was diving with my dad in Mexico. At the time, he had 25 years of experience. I'd only just been certified, and this was my first recreational dive after that. Since we were on vacation, we had to book with an outfit group. The boat and equipment didn't look high-end, but it was about average for local outfits. A few minutes after descent, Dad is swimming furiously to the dive leader, doing the no air sign, and after a couple of seconds of no response, basically grabs the guy's octopus rig. I don't know if the dive leader was confused, but he was grabbing at my dad's hand as he reached for him. We ascended, and he told me that his primary flooded, and the secondary had stopped too. Not sure what happened, but oh my god. My dad was obviously furious at the guy, and for whatever the hell had been the wrong equipment, but otherwise unfazed. I was mostly confused underwater, not fully understanding what I'd seen. The real fear set in later. What if I'd taken that rig? Just trained, 19 years old, an experience only in close supervised settings. I don't know if I would have reacted correctly, especially with someone trying to grab my hand. It was scary. I've only done a handful of dives over the last 19 years, and they were all amazing. I went scuba diving, which is air tanks on surface and air delivered by hose, for the first time about 8 years ago. And on my second trip down, the instructor returned to the surface to check my tanks. I was 15 feet down, and my mask began filling with water, and I couldn't clear it. I could still breathe through my mouth, but I made the mistake of looking up to see how far I would have to swim to reach the surface if breathing was a problem. The surface seemed a lot further away than I thought it was, and I recall it triggering something akin to my fear of heights. But I kept my head and continued to breathe normally, and gave the guy my signal to return to the surface. I didn't want to attempt to begin the ascent by myself, because my dive instructor was a real dick when I first arrived with a camera in tow. I had called before I made my reservation or brought the camera and underwater housing, and they said it would be fine. But of course, when you get there, he's actually a dick, and says that I'm an idiot for trying to bring it along. I thought he might end my dive right there, and in fairness, after I explained to him that I had no intention of screwing around, and that I understood how dangerous diving was, and that I had researched the hand signals and such before I arrived, he was a little bit better. But I still didn't trust him after the initial fiasco. Luckily, I managed to reach the surface, but nonetheless, having your helmet fill up and having no oxygen being fed to you was no doubt the scariest moment of my life. If I hadn't have got his attention quick enough, or if certain situations would have happened where he would have been distracted, no doubt that could have ended a lot worse than it fortunately did.
This is a true story, told to me by a man who had been working as a murder investigator for over 30 years at the time. I was told this story after asking what the creepiest case he had ever been involved in was. This happened in the late 80s, in a part of the country that is mostly covered in dense pine forest. On the highway between cities in this part of the country, you rarely come across towns. There are stretches that seem to go on forever, with only pine trees as far as you can see. A young girl in her early 20s was taking a motor coach home. This happened just as winter was approaching and it was freezing outside after nightfall. This girl lived in one of these really small communities that you pass along the highway, but during the bus trip, she fell asleep and missed her stop. Looking at her watch, she realized that they had passed it only recently, and that if she were to get off, she would be able to walk back in approximately 3 hours. Either that, or get off in the next city, where she didn't know anyone or had any place to stay. She explained all of this to the bus driver, who pulled off at the next parking space and then let her out. That was the last time anyone saw her. Almost 15 years later, long after the search for her has been given up, she is stumbled upon by a hiker. Her dead body was found tied to a tree, very deep into the dense, almost impassable forest. The autopsy showed no signs of physical violence of any kind. Someone had just left her there, tied to a tree, alive. This didn't happen to me, but I was involved in it. The victim was actually my girlfriend, and I got the story from her later. At the time my girlfriend and I were attending college together. It was a small school in a pretty quiet place, so most of the students were from the area. My girlfriend Katie was one of them. I came from a distance and so lived in a dorm at the college. Katie and I would hang out together in my dorm between classes, and even some evenings and weekends when we wanted to be together, but didn't feel like going out. It was a Friday night, and both of us, being pretty introverted, decided not to do anything crazy, so we planned to spend the night in my room with each other. as my roommate was out that night. She wanted some time to go home after classes and assured me that she would be back around 8 o'clock. Katie had a car, but she never liked driving. Unless she had to pack her instrument, she usually took the bus. That Friday night, she had a pretty unnerving experience in doing so that freaked the two of us out for a long while after it happened. She was a smart girl, definitely didn't look like a college-aged student. She was short, thin, and quiet. Standing alone at a bus stop in the dark was probably not ideal, but she preferred that over taking her own car. She waited for the bus, innocent as a rose, when a van drove past her. And then it drove by again, and again, and again. She was a bit suspicious, but told herself that he was probably just lost. The van then pulled over right in front of the stop, and the driver rolled his window down.
"Isn't it cold out here?"
he asked.
"The bus is always late. Hop in and I'll give you a ride."
Katie declined politely and took a few steps back, trying to show him that she wasn't interested in anything that he wanted. He asked again if she was absolutely sure that she didn't want to ride, and then he drove away after she turned him down again. The bus arrived moments later, and she was relieved to step on. To her horror, she then noticed the same van right behind the bus. The van followed the bus directly, and Katie texted me to explain the situation. I could tell that she was very scared. I offered to stay on the phone with her to calm her nerves, and she accepted. We talked about school and things to get her mind off of it, and once her stop came, she felt safe enough to hang up the phone and walk the short distance to the college. When she arrived at my dorm room, she was hysterical. It took me over an hour to comfort her enough to get the story out of her, and this is what she told me. The van had stopped following the bus after getting stuck at a red light, giving the bus a chance to get ahead. However, after getting off at her stop, the van sped up to her. He was driving like a maniac at this point. The bus had already pulled away when the van stopped next to her. It had pulled over right where she intended to go to get to the college, so in a panic, she bolted the other way, and the driver raced after her. When she turned her head to look behind her, she noticed he was holding a butcher knife and waving it in front of him in her direction. She did a wide turn to get back on track to the college, the man following close behind. Lucky for her, he lost his footing on an icy patch on the road, and his fall delayed him enough for her to get far enough ahead. When he got back up, he didn't chase after her again, but instead yelled out. Since then, she has always taken her own car instead of the bus. When I was growing up, my little brother, who was 3 at the time, used to sleepwalk through our house at night. He would walk down to the basement where I slept and crack open my door between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. He would then slowly push it open and shuffle inside. When I would ask him what he was doing, he would always stare at the floor and say, "Where's Mom?" I would tell him that she was upstairs, and he would repeat, "Where's Mom?" Each night I would take him back upstairs and lead him back to bed where he would fall asleep. One night, at about 1 a.m., I awoke to hear crying at the bottom of the stairs. I walked out to investigate, and he was sitting on the bottom step. I asked him what was wrong, and he again asked, "Where's Mom?" I told him that she was upstairs and that we should go get her. "No," he said, staring at the floor. "There's a bloody head following me." "What?" I asked. He looked up from the floor, stared me right in the eyes, opened his mouth, and let out the shrillest, blood-curdling scream I have ever heard in my life. It scared the living hell out of me. It was so loud that the whole family got out of their beds to see what was going on. After that, I never asked him again what he was doing downstairs. I would just take him immediately back to his room. Several months ago, my cat went missing in the woods, and I had to go look for him. It was late at night, and the moon was a thin crescent, so the only source of light was my flashlight. I had seen my cat several times, but he seemed to be scared of something. Every time I got close, he would run further away. At a certain point, he got scared of something, and then ran back towards the house. I started to make my way back, and then I saw a man. He was just standing there, absolutely still. He had nondescript brown hair and a tweed jacket on. I could make out all of his facial features except his eyes, where there seemed to just be a shadow. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I then said, "I can see you, you know," and was greeted with silence. I turned and walked a few steps, and then turned around. He was closer. I turned and walked some more, and then looked again. This time, he was partially hidden behind a tree. I didn't need any more warning. I booked it back to my house, where my cat desperately wanted to come inside. We went inside and I locked the doors and sat on my couch until I calmed down. Ever since that night, every few weeks, I hear a noise at my window. A slow, loud, rhythmic tap. There's no trees out there, and most of the nights that it's happened, there's no wind. Every time, I've been too scared to look, probably for the better. The last thing I want to see is a man with a tweed jacket, with no eyes. When I was young, my grandma came over to our house to babysit me one night. Nothing unusual happened the whole night, but when my mom got home, she checked the answering machine, and there was a message a few minutes long. The message was just the sound of my grandmother and myself laughing hysterically for the entire message. Like I said, the night was normal, and there wasn't any moment when the phone rang or we laughed hysterically for minutes on end. Once when I was a teenager, I was waiting at an abandoned gas station in downtown Akron to meet a dealer to buy some weed. This was in about 1993 or 1994, so payphones were still functional and in pretty common use. As I was waiting, the payphone in the parking lot started ringing. Bear in mind, it was at about sunset on the outskirts of downtown, and not another single person was around. Out of curiosity, I picked up the phone. The man on the other line asked, "Is this Chad?" "My name isn't Chad," I said. The man ignored me and said, "Chad, I want you to do bad things to me." I stated again that I wasn't Chad and asked him what he wanted and if he knew that he was calling a payphone. He ignored me again and went into very explicit and specific detail about all the things he wanted Chad to do to him. I was laughing and told him again that I wasn't Chad. Finally, he said he knew for sure that I was Chad and described to me what Chad looks like. He described me perfectly down to the color of my shirt and what type of shoes I was currently wearing. I immediately hung up and looked around. There was no one. I mean, not a single person anywhere. I got into my car and got the hell out of there. I have Google Voice set to transcribe any voicemails I get and send them to me via text message. So I get a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, and the transcription that it sends me via text message is, "Hi, Fritz." So later that day, I check my Google Voice page and listen to the voicemail. It is 30 seconds of absolute silence. Google Voice transcribed the block of silence into the greeting, "Hi, Fritz." The creepy part about it is, the only person who called me by my nickname Fritz was my grandfather, who has been dead for 3 years. One night I was having this really odd dream. It was one of those ridiculously long dreams that seems like it lasts for years while you are asleep. This one lasted a whole lifetime. I watched a woman live her life. I watched as she was a child, as she grew up. I watched her go through school, college. I watched her social life evolve. I watched her romance and her marriage and her pregnancy. I watched her live her midlife, raise her children, and then grow old. It was a pretty normal life. I didn't see any trauma. I didn't remember how she died, but the moment it was over, I woke up. I had to go to the bathroom really bad, probably 4 a.m, barely awake, and went to the bathroom. As I sat there and peed, I saw her face looking at me through the window. The woman, she was there, old, wrinkled, wide-eyed and gaping mouth with the most horrible, scornful face looking at me. It didn't faze me at the time. I got up and walked back to my bed and fell right back asleep. I didn't realize until the next morning the horrifying thing that I had seen. One night, a friend I went to med school with was driving back home from his girlfriend's house when a large dog ran out in front of his car. My friend had no time to swerve and hit the dog head on. Being an animal lover, he jumped out of the car to see if the dog is all right. But before he can come around to the front, he sees the dog get up on 2 legs and run off into the field next to him. He has been telling this story for years, and I know that he is telling the truth. Every time I've seen him tell the story, he has had a very strange expression on his face. I was working late at the bank, 11 p.m., last one in. It's pitch black outside and the bank is essentially isolated, far away from anything nearby. I am very alone. I'm walking around installing new printers, and all of a sudden the security monitors in my IT room turn off. I get up and go check the plugs to make sure nothing came loose. As I lean over to inspect the cables, all the lights in the building die and I'm plunged into darkness. My heart starts racing from the shock and I feel the adrenaline building. I reach into my pocket to get my phone to use as a light, but before I get it out, the backup lights turn on and the whole building is dimly lit by the faint green glow of backup lights. The lights are very weak, but it's good enough to see. A green-tinged blackness. I can make out the objects in the room, though most things are still in shadow. I leave my phone where it is. I forget the monitors and start walking toward the banking hall, where all of the tills are, because that's where the circuit breakers are, and I guess it's up to me to fix this. The bank is built like a bomb shelter, with thick concrete walls and multiple heavy lock metal doors. I have to swipe my ID card multiple times to get to the hall, and I'm scared that I could get locked in between 2 doors if the power fail has messed up that system. I'm quietly thinking about what I would do if such a thing happened, and I'm still a bit jumpy from the shock earlier. I'm looking over my shoulder and studying the shadows that I walk past, and that's when I hear a blood-curdling scream. It's long and loud and primal. I can almost feel it vibrating in the air. It's coming from the banking hall. I freeze in place right before the final door, freaking out, and just stare at the gray-green lock of the metal door as I listen. The scream seems never-ending. It feels like the scream has been going on for 3 minutes or more without taking a breath, but the adrenaline makes telling time difficult. I try and control my breathing. I check behind me down the shadowy concrete green corridor I came from and decide that I need to press on. I turn to the door, swipe my card, and open the door as fast as I can, bursting through, ready for anything. I manage to scan half of the room as I open the door before I'm blinded by a strong white light. The scream suddenly and abruptly stops. My eyes adjust and I see that the light was the main lights reactivating. I'm staring into a normal room. The silence was terrifying, heart pounding in my chest and my ears. But everything seems in order. the white light bouncing pleasantly from letters on tables, the computers turned off and quiet, the bulletproof glass, all fine. Door to the front, still locked. The scream was gone, and whoever was screaming, unaccounted for, and the lights were back on. Being quite freaked out at this point, I left out the back way in a panic and called it a night. The scariest moment of my life happened while my friend and I were camping in eastern Canada as teenagers. We decided to sleep in this abandoned camper we found deep in a large forest that was near our town. It had been there for so long that small trees had grown around it. We had stumbled across it when we were exploring a few months back and thought it would be cool and brave to sleep in it for one night. So one weekend, we did. We arrived after dark because we had gotten lost trying to find the camper. We had a really low power flashlight, so it made it even more difficult. Once we finally found it, we opened the rusty door and stepped in. The sounds inside the camper were shrill and echoed. There were typical camper things strewn about: cups, empty cans, and old novels that were falling apart. Already tired, we holed up in one end of the camper where the bed area had originally been before the cushions had rotted away to almost nothing. A long hallway stretched the length of the camper, so we could basically see from end to end. It was a miserable night. There were several rats living in there. I saw them staring at us from a chewed-out part of the ceiling. When the wind blew outside, the camper would shriek and groan. We even thought we heard a bear outside, walking around. Still, we pretended to be brave and acted like we were having a good time, but we were both on edge. At some point, I woke up from an uncomfortable sleep. I sat up to adjust myself when I noticed some movement out of the corner of my eye. At the other end of the camper, there was a small window, and as I looked at it, I saw a man's silhouette. He was clearly staring straight at me from outside. At first, I thought maybe it was a weird shape of a tree or something, but when I moved a bit to get a better look, the person clearly reacted and then froze. My heart was pumping, and I woke up my friend immediately, saying, "Someone is here," over and over in a whisper, not taking my eyes off of the man outside. My friend woke up immediately and nodded towards the window. He saw him too. We whispered frantically about who it could be and why he was staring at us, and for the next 10 minutes, no joke, we stared him down. The longer we stared at him, the more frightened we got. Occasionally he would move, but always keeping his eyes locked on us. Eventually I shouted at him, "Hey!" No reaction. My friend was braver than me and decided to shine the flashlight at him. As soon as he did, the man ducked and disappeared. We slowly got up, packed up our things, and sprinted out into the dark woods. I looked behind me several times, but as far as I know, the man did not follow. I was in Bermuda in the off-season with my mom, dad, and little brother. I must have been about 5 years old or so. It was before my other brother and sister were born. I remember the hotel was empty. I remember the beach was empty. Most of this place was empty. I don't recall ever seeing anyone else. I was on the beach with my parents and my little brother. I ran off to explore, and I saw my mom further ahead on the beach. She yelled at me, "Come over here." There was a thicket area of scrubby bushes and trees along the beach. She went up into it and disappeared. There was this cement square with pipes or vents or something coming out of it. I walked over to it and saw her standing there. As I approached her, I felt that something was wrong. She motioned for me to continue coming towards her, and I didn't want to be defiant, so I pretended I was really interested in the pipe things and said out loud, "I wonder what these are for," or something like that. As soon as she walked further out of view, my dad came up from behind me on the beach and yelled, "What are you doing? Don't wander off like that." He took my hand roughly and led me back to the beach, where my mother was sitting in a chair. I still don't know what happened or who I saw. The woman looked exactly like my mom, but something felt wrong. I worked at a campground on the night shift, 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. every night. It wasn't bad. I would bring in my PS2 and game a good portion of the night, only having to deal with 1 or 2 people on busy nights. It was just me in this little 8x8 shack, with nothing around but dark, all night. My first week there, the other third shift guy who was quitting told me about this payphone a few feet from the shack where I worked. He said that it rang every night at 4:17 a.m. exactly. Just once. It would only ring once. It was probably just an automated test call, he guessed. He's never answered it himself. I go for a few months with the job. It was the middle of summer, so most nights I had the windows closed so I couldn't hear the payphone go off. In mid-August, I started leaving the windows open during the night. Sure enough, at 4:17 a.m. every morning, the phone would ring once. The ring even sounded creepy somehow. One night, I got up the nerve to answer the phone. I set an alarm at 4:15 and would go wait at the phone until it rang. When it did, I answered it, but there was no sound, just dead air, like someone was on the other line but wasn't saying anything. I said hello a few times and then hung up. I did this every night for a week with the same exact results. I didn't think anything of it and then left it alone after that for about a month. The first week of October, I decided to answer the phone once again. I set my alarm, and when the time came, I answered it. Hello? Hello? Then I heard what sounded like someone inhaling and exhaling through clenched teeth. The voice I heard was rough and sounded like he had gargled gravel. He said my name, my complete name, first, middle, and last. It was a voice I had never heard before, and I will never forget. I was too scared to say anything and hung up the phone. I rattled some change into the payphone and hit *69. The number had come from California. I live in Indiana. I used to live in a house next to an abandoned train station, and one day, a friend of mine and I decided to explore it. We had done this before, but this time something was different. One of the old train wagons that we had seen before had curtains in the windows, when they didn't before. Naturally, I tried to peek inside, but as I got close to the windows, the curtains suddenly flung open and an elderly woman stared back at me with a terrified look on her face. I have honestly never been more scared in my entire life, and naturally I just sprinted the hell out of there. To this day, I have no idea why that woman was in there. Years later, I walked past the train station at night. It was such a creepy place. I haven't been back since. When I was 8, my mom, dad, and younger brother were visiting some relatives. We ended up staying the night, with my brother and I sleeping on cots near my parents' bed. In the middle of the night, I distinctly remember feeling incredibly cold and waking up. While attempting to rearrange my sheets, I looked up and saw my dad wide awake and staring intently at something behind me. When I turned to see, I saw several small little glowing eyes behind me. Turning back to my dad, we made eye contact and I jumped up into bed with him, but he did not move or speak at all. Even under the comforter, I was chilled to the bone. He was visibly tense and concentrating very hard, and I swear I could see the little glowing eyes moving closer. And then they reached my brother laying on his cot. When they did, I didn't feel as cold anymore, but I felt very strange, like a mix of dozens of emotions without being any particular one. I looked at my dad, who looked very sullen and sad. He put his arm around me and then went back to sleep. The next morning we were awoken by my brother throwing up all over the carpet. This continued for hours. He had a terrible fever, chills, and had a really hard time speaking. My father moved him downstairs and gave him some painkillers, but my brother said that it didn't work at all. About lunchtime, we decided to take an early leave and go home. Less than 20 minutes into the car ride, my brother said he felt completely fine again. My father and I talked about this a few years ago, and only more recently told my brother and my mom about it. We have since slept there in different rooms without incident, but my mom sleeping in there once on a trip had a similar experience. Vomiting, fever, chills, only to be fine minutes later after leaving the house. We don't sleep in that room anymore. It was going on 10, and I was taking my last patient back to her room. She was a little old lady who was stable enough to ride in a wheelchair, but definitely needed assistance on her feet. I got her back to her room and helped her into bed. I made sure she was comfortable and set the bed alarm before turning out the lights and leaving her room. I pulled the curtain behind me so as to not let too much light in, but not all the way so that I could still see her in bed from the hallway. Her nurse was in the room next door, and I needed to speak with her. While I was standing there, waiting for the nurse to come out of the other room, I distinctly saw a person walk past the curtain inside the old woman's room. The person was about the same height as the woman and had the same gray hair. At first I thought, she shouldn't be up walking around. Then I remembered the bed alarm was set. The room was totally silent, and when I looked in, I could see her still laying there, exactly where I had left her. She had not moved an inch, and the bed alarm was still armed. That's when I got the most intense, full-body chills of my life. The nurse came out of the other room. I gave her my message, and then booked it out of there. I was trying to sleep one night in my room, back when I was younger and lived with my folks. I must have been about 17 or 18. I opened my eyes while rolling over to get comfortable, and I see a black figure just outside my door, who I thought was my stepfather. He had his hands up by his chest making the scary finger motions, like you might do sarcastically after a scary story, or a witch might do when casting a spell, just moving fingers wildly in my direction. I should note that this figure had no defined shape. It looked like squiggles that moved in a vague shape, and I chalked it up to the lack of light. I look over and say, "What are you doing?" thinking that he was just being really weird and trying to be creepy. In that moment, the person disappeared. They were gone. It was at that moment my heart sank and I became petrified with fear. One of the few moments in my life that I was so scared out of my mind and could not comprehend what I had just seen. Me and some buddies were bored one night and decided to head out and poke around an abandoned mental hospital. The only way in was through the autopsy room. The rest of the place was pretty much sealed off. So we get inside, me, another guy, and two girls. As soon as we get into the autopsy room, one of the girls starts hyperventilating and crying. She said she just couldn't be there any longer. We tried everything we could to convince her that everything was going to be fine, to no avail. She wanted to leave, and she wanted to leave now. Disappointed, we started to leave. The two girls were walking in front of us, one trying to comfort the other, while me and the other guy were walking behind. I don't know what brought me to look back. Morbid curiosity, maybe. But I did. Now, I'll admit that it was dark, but the moon was out, so it wasn't pitch black. Still, I know what I saw. A window on the second floor, what looked like a face staring back at me. I looked for a good 10 seconds, stopped my buddy and had him look, without taking my eyes off of it, and asked him specifically, "Do you see that?" I thought I may have been seeing things, or maybe it was the trick of the light. But no, He saw it too, and we both stood there and stared for a good 20 seconds. I might have thought it was some kind of trick, but after 20 seconds or so, the face moved away from the window, and we ran away, passing the girls and screaming at them to get in the car. What were the chances that other people were exploring the same time as us? I don't know. All I know is I know what I saw. There was a person standing in that window, the second-story window, in an abandoned mental hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning. I have memories that are very early, and most of them are scary, but one memory is different. When I was very young, I'm talking between age 2 and 3, I used to see this man who looked just like my dad when he would hold his cheeks to make this goofy face. Only this guy's face was like that without holding it. I recall playing with Legos with my brother in our room, and the guy walking by the window, turning slowly to look in, bulging eyes, and just starts screaming. I would sit on the floor frozen in fear. My brother didn't see these things, and now that I think of it, this man I saw was never directly in front of me. I only saw him through windows. I am pretty sure that I was a child who hallucinated when they were very young. It was in my first year at university, completely new to the city and its surroundings. One evening, my friend and I decided to take a trip to the mall. It was 8 p.m. and we got on a bus that my friend claimed would take us to the mall. We ended up at an empty bus terminal, and it was around 10 o'clock at this time. We waited and waited for another bus to come, and there was no one there but us. A while later, an old man walked by and told us that since it's so late, another bus won't be coming for another hour or so. He told us to turn and walk down the road, and we would find another bus stop where a bus would come sooner. We followed his instructions and entered this single-lane road with tall trees on each side. There were only a few street lamps working, so the area was dimly lit. The road was sort of built on a slant. All we could see was the road and the trees on either side for a long distance. Once we arrived, we waited. My phone battery died, and my friend had forgotten hers in her dorm room. We were starting to think that there wouldn't be any bus coming, and started to panic. Then, as we were waiting, I turned around to see two kids with backpacks walking down the road. I was relieved to see them, and so was my friend. When they were close by, I asked them if they knew about any buses that might come. The kids were about 12 or 13 years old. One was a boy and the other was a girl. "Hey, do you know if there are any buses coming?" The boy responds, "Let me check." He takes his phone out of his pocket and is looking at it for a short time. Meanwhile, my friend started talking to the girl. The girl didn't respond. The boy eventually looked up and said that the bus would be here in 10 minutes. I turned my head to my friend and she was looking at me, and then I turned my head back to thank the boy, and they were gone. The girl and the boy were gone. Nowhere to be seen. I literally probably looked away for 1 second max. We both looked down the road, turned around and looked up the other way and by the trees. They had a fence around them, but even if they went there, we would have seen them. I literally looked away for a second. Needless to say, both of us were scared as hell until the bus arrived. It was the last bus, and it was around 12:17 a.m. when it finally showed up. I have never believed in paranormal activities, but I can't seem to find a reasonable explanation for this. I was living in an apartment with 3 roommates at the time. I was working all sorts of weird hours and would stay up late most nights. Our apartment had 2 hallways that formed a capital L. My room was at the top of the L. The bathroom was in the corner of where the lines meet. I left the bathroom one night to go back to my room, and just as I turned the bathroom lights off, there, standing in the hallway next to the living room, was a teenage girl. She was wearing a white dress, just smiling at me. She didn't look evil, just a normal person standing there smiling at me. I freaked out and went running for my bedroom. About 20 minutes later, I finally came out of my room, turning all of the lights on as I went through the apartment searching for her. She was nowhere to be seen. I lived there for about another year, and I never saw her again. This happened when I was around 7 years old, and it was near the holidays. The house I grew up in had a basement. I left my pillow down there one day after watching movies and went to grab it later that evening. I grab the pillow and look up and see a man on the other side of the room, looking around, paying no attention to me. I'm staring, jaw wide open, completely petrified with fright. He looks up at me, notices that I can see him, and then drops his jaw lower than humanly normal, almost as if he was screaming, but no sound was coming out. I then ran up the stairs. I told everyone in the house, and they went down to look, but of course. This happened to me when I was a junior in high school. It was December, and it had just started snowing that evening. My best friend and I were in debate class and getting ready for our state qualifiers that were the next day. We were writing our cases and, as usual, at each other's throats over the details. It was a stressful, tense evening. We finally finished our cases at about 3 a.m. Then, we went to my room for the night. Almost as soon as we get into my room, we hear what sounds like the water turning on the other side of the house. No big deal, probably my parents, I thought. Then, we hear the front door open. I told my friend, I bet my mom woke up and wanted some fresh air. She does that sometimes. I really thought that's what it was, until we heard incredibly heavy footsteps in my living room, headed towards my bedroom. They were not my mother or anyone else in my family. Then they stopped. My friend and I looked at each other and were both freaked out, just standing, frozen in my room. We moved closer to each other, and the footsteps started again, but this time they were running. We both flipped out, my bedroom door flew open, and we screamed. Nobody was there. We ran to the bathroom that's connected to my room. I closed and locked the door and stood against it. When we finally built up the courage to do it, we sprinted to my parents' room, crying hysterically. We obviously startled my parents awake. They said that neither of them had gotten up. My dad grabbed his gun out of the closet and then looked around the house. There was no sign of anyone. I heard this story from a girl that I met in Korea. One day she was walking home late one night after work. She lived in an apartment where they had an elevator. She got in the elevator, and when the door was about to close, a man with a red hoodie entered the elevator. He apologized for scaring her and asked which floor she was heading to. Without making any eye contact, she told him out of fear. As the elevator moved, he asked her if he could use her cell phone, and she declined and isolated herself in the corner. After seconds of silence, the elevator arrived to the floor below the one the girl was heading to, and the door opened. The guy slowly walked out of the door and then turned around facing her. He stared at her without any movement with a blank expression. Slowly the door started to close, and from the small gap right at the last second, she saw him turn and start walking up the stairs, pulling a knife out of his pocket. The elevator started to move up, and she frantically started to smash the closed door button. Unfortunately, the door opened anyway. She looked around, and he was nowhere to be seen. She ran to her apartment, went inside, and locked the door. She never saw the man again. My brother once lived in a flat in downtown Mount Clemens. The Clem was known to be a hot spot for baths back in the Depression era and was booming with activity. Nowadays, it has some run-down parts, and this is where my brother rented his flat. It was a giant, old, raggedy house which was now separated into multiple odd apartments. He always admitted to odd experiences, cupboard doors opening up, things missing, but one peculiar oddity, that he was always missing his boxers from his drawer. He admitted that he thought his house was haunted. Never anything violent or disturbing, just odd things like his boxer shorts going missing. Later on, he started dating his future ex-wife. She started coming around, and he noticed that the oddities began to increase. New oddities began to occur. His girlfriend would always find her shoes, which were left on a mat inside the apartment, outside the door on the patio in the morning. She would always comment to my brother to stop putting her shoes outside. He knew what was going on, but he didn't want to frighten her. Things started to get worse. He comes home from work and his girlfriend was staying there while he was gone. She claims that the stove burner kept lighting itself. She would walk into the kitchen and it would be lit. She would turn it off and shortly later it would be lit again. Then, one night my brother wakes up in the middle of the night and sees his girlfriend sitting at the edge of the bed. Not just sees, but feels her near his feet, staring at him. He calls out for her to come back to bed. She doesn't respond, so he calls out louder, telling her to come to bed, and asked her what she was doing. His girlfriend then asks what he was doing. He turns and she's sleeping next to him. He turns back, and no one is at the end of the bed. Now, of course, he's freaked out, but doesn't want to scare his girlfriend from coming over to his house in the future. A few nights later, they're both sleeping, and he wakes up to his girlfriend screaming. He looks over and she's sleeping but thrashing around, holding onto her neck. He doesn't see anything, so he starts yelling and shaking her to wake up. After a few shakes, she wakes up crying and terrified. She starts telling my brother about how real her dream felt, that a woman was strangling her, telling her to get out, that she didn't belong there. Her neck had red marks on it, possibly from herself holding her neck, but they believed it to be from something else. My brother then comes clean with her. They decide to do some research and find out that the address that they lived in was an old brothel back in the day. My brother lived in that house for a few more weeks before he could locate a new place. She never came back to stay the night though, and he never experienced anything aggressive while there. Still, it's messed up. I know my brother, and I can tell when he's lying. This was legit, and when he talked about it, you could see the fear in his eyes. A couple years back, my best friend and I went on a road trip to the States for a music festival. We met up with some friends, saw lots of things and whatnot. One of our friends comes back home with us. He needed to get back home for school, and his buddies didn't want to head home yet. We decided to drive straight home in shifts. It took about 24 hours for the full drive. My story starts where I'm driving the night shift at about 2 a.m. It is a beautifully clear night. Full moon, no clouds, middle of summer. While noticing all of these conditions, I also noticed that we have followed the GPS onto a back road and driven into a very large valley. Open fields, not another car or house in sight. And it is important to note that we have not seen anyone or anything relating to human presence for a few hours. Upon entering this valley, we lose our satellite signal. We have no satellite radio, no GPS, and no cell signal either. However, I figure it doesn't really matter, as I know that we follow this road for a couple more hours. About 20 minutes after entering this valley, and after losing all of our connections, we come upon a bridge. As we get closer, I see a car pulled out on the side of the road. Not uncommon. People sleep in pullouts when they can. What is uncommon is this car has all of its windows blacked out. With all of the light from the moon, we should be able to see at least partially inside, but it was completely black. Getting closer, we also realize that it has no license plate that we can see. No big deal. We assumed that it was just abandoned out here. That is, until we passed this vehicle, and almost immediately its lights turn on, and it pulls out behind us on the road. Now this is where it gets creepy. This vehicle starts tailgating us, in the middle of nowhere, and we can't see who is inside. Again, we brush it off. Maybe he is lost, needs to follow someone out of the area, but it doesn't explain the windows being blacked out, or the lack of a license plate. With this car following us, I start to get an uneasy feeling, subtle at first, but growing stronger. Soon I start to feel very panicked, and I want to get away from this vehicle ASAP. It's important to note that I do not frighten easily. I do not panic. I felt panicked at this time because I felt that my life was in danger. I tried to push these feelings aside, as it seems like the silliest response to a possibly explainable situation. That is, until I see something in the middle of the road. Coming closer, we see what looks to be a body laying in the middle of the lanes. This is not a big road, and like I said, it was also a back road, still paved, but very small. At this moment, and at the sight of what appears to be a body in the road ahead, we start freaking out. I, in no way, am stopping for any reason in this desolate and isolated area. There are no other vehicles around other than the one following us, and I can see no housing or lights as far as the eye can see. No cell service, no satellite, nothing. By this time we are almost upon it. There is no room to go around, as there are no shoulders on the road and deep ditches on the sides. And we are close enough to see now that it is a scarecrow. I drive over it and continue on. This car, small enough to go around it, continues to follow us. I speed up, and then it speeds up. I slow down, and then it slows down, until I punch the gas. After about 2 minutes of this, the car slows down, does a U-turn, and then drives back the opposite direction. Now my passenger turns to me and says, "I swear I saw spikes in that thing." Lucky for us, we were driving a very big truck. The wheel span was bigger than the scarecrow on the road, and we never even touched it. It was another half hour before we reached cell services, and the satellite picked back up. It wasn't until we reached home at 5 a.m. that we remembered during this time that there had been a couple of missing people reported in our province. Ones who were on vacation and driving home from the States who never made it home or were ever found. I and my passengers fully believe that we escaped some crazy Wolf Creek type of situation. We contacted the police about it and ended up making a full police report. However, we were unable to pinpoint the exact location. There wasn't anything they could really do other than file the report. We definitely didn't want this to happen to anyone else, as it was creepy as hell. My best friend once told me a story I'll never forget. He used to play the games on his mom's cell phone when he was a young child, and one night he fell asleep with it in bed. His mom found him sleeping and took the phone back. Later that night, she was looking at the phone pictures and found a picture of this crazy half-face close-up of a stranger and my friend sleeping in the background in his bed.
In about 2012, my then boyfriend lived in Sweden, and I lived in Canada. He came to visit me, and during one of the evenings, I woke up to something strange perched at the foot of my bed. It was a pale, thin, humanoid figure. It was completely hairless, and the legs seemed to be bowed in some way. It seemed to walk on all fours despite looking human. I couldn't see much of its face, since it was looking away from me. It looked a lot like the creature from the fictional story, The Rake. When I gasped, it hopped off the bed and into the darkness. My partner heard me and woke up to ask me what was wrong. I didn't tell him, as not to alarm him while trying to rest. In 2014, he was visiting once more, and we were once again in bed sleeping. I woke up to hear my boyfriend screaming like I'd never heard him before. I immediately turned on the light and shook him to try and snap him out of it, but he just screamed and then cried. After 30 minutes or so, he finally was calm enough to explain what had happened. Apparently he woke up to a pale humanoid figure with a gaping mouth and black, sunken eyes, basically on top of him. As he screamed, the figure slowly backed itself into the closet while staring at him the whole time and crawling on all fours. I felt sick. I never ever told him about what I saw a few years ago, and there's no way he could have known and described what I saw perfectly like that. Now here's why I'm posting. It showed up again. My ex messaged me today, as we're still friends, and told me that his now girlfriend has seen what he refers to as the Pale Man. They were asleep, and apparently she woke up to see this thing stalking around the room, and it noticed her frozen in fear, so it crawled up next to her. My ex woke up and tried to console her, and she was describing what she saw. It apparently was a perfect match to the thing we both saw. I only ever told him what I saw after his experience, and she had never heard of either of our experiences. Is this just a mass coincidence of hallucinating while waking up? Is it a demon of some sort? A haunting? A skinwalker? I have no clue. But I am legitimately freaked out. We were in a river, in a city around Savannah, looking for a sidearm that was thrown in to avoid detection. The water was zero visibility, even though it was only 7 to 8 feet deep, and we were basically using our hands and feet to scour the area. After about 45 minutes, and a lot of boredom, something big swam past me. It never touched me, but pushed the water around me enough to flip me over head over heels. Imagine being underwater and pushing your hand past your face as fast as you can and feeling the water rush by. I felt 4 tugs on the landing line telling me to surface, so I immediately tugged the line that was attached to my partner 4 times and started to ascend. When we got to the surface, the guys on the boat started screaming at me to get out of the water. A giant gator was seen entering the water and swimming in our direction. Even the local guy was a healthy shade of green. 10 years later, I still think about the alligator I never saw. This takes place on Christmas night 2007, at roughly 8:30 p.m. in the evening. The day was pleasant and festive, opening presents early in the morning with my sisters, a hearty breakfast made by my father, and delicious smells from the kitchen as my parents both prepared a feast. There were visits from extended family, bringing pies and cakes for dessert. At around 2, we all sat down to eat, and then lazed about the rest of the afternoon into the evening, just talking, catching up, and doing the general Christmassy thing. After our food had managed to be partially digested, and we weren't feeling absolutely stuffed, I decided to head over to visit my friend in the next village. The drive would take about 10 minutes, if I took the back roads to get there. So I did. It was a little past 8 p.m, and my friend lived in a housing development surrounding a private lake. You might have called it a gated community. You could still drive through it freely after hours by entering one of 4 private entry points. Since the community was built around a lake, the roads surrounding it were in a spiral sort of shape. Those houses were sparsely positioned on the outmost parts of the spiral road, closest to the 4 private entry points. As you drove in further, there were a lot more houses positioned closer together near the lake. My friend lived on the outer edge of this development, so once I reached the entry point, it would only take me another few minutes until I reached his house. His house, along with the others, were far enough apart from each other that you couldn't see them from the road as you drove by. There were either woods all around with long drives, or open fields with long drives. You could see porch lights in the distance, but that was about it. As I entered into the development, the speed limit dropped from 30 miles per hour to 20. There were no street lights in the development, and for some reason, I never put my high beams on. I couldn't go any faster than the speed limit, because there were so many speed bumps in place every 30 feet or so. It was a mild night. I remember having my driver's side windows slightly open, taking in some fresh air. And I remember driving in silence, which was unusual for me, as I usually listened to music while driving. I must have been enjoying the quietness after the commotion of the day, although it had been fun. I reached a section of road that had barren fields on either side and woods set back. Houses were probably nestled back into the trees, and as I drove, I noticed what looked like someone walking up ahead on the opposite side of the road coming in my direction. Mind you, I was still going at about 20 miles per hour the whole time, so it was probably less than a minute by the time the walker came into clear view. I got a quick scan of it from my windshield before my car and it were exactly parallel, and this is what I saw. It was not a person. It stood on 2 long legs, with long arms hanging down from its shoulders. It was strong looking, lean, muscular, but not beefy in stature. It looked thin at the same time. It stood at least 7 feet tall. It was light-coloured, not sure whether it was white, tan, yellow or greyish. It didn't appear to have fur, but there was some texture to the skin. It wasn't smooth. There appeared to be something coming down off its back. I don't know what it was. All I can recall about its face is the small features it had, but the mouth and jaw were notably large. It had pointed things atop of its head, 2 things going straight upwards, with something mingled between the 2 things. That's what I got from a very quick scan, and from my observation of it as it neared my car. As my car became parallel to it, within a split second, I went from looking at my windshield to looking at it from my driver's side window. In that moment, its face quickly peered down at me, and all I remember was the mouth wide open. Out came a remarkable scream that I shall never forget. Gives me the chills just thinking about it. It consisted of a high-pitched shrill/shriek, enveloped by a deep guttural growl. Both sounds happened simultaneously in that scream. I kept driving all the while. This was happening so fast that I didn't even have a chance to be scared or shocked. I continued driving and went past my friend's house and drove home. I called him to tell him what happened, and that I just needed to get back. I was probably running on adrenaline to get back home. Later on, I was in total shock after it sunk in. Had my driver's side window been opened fully, it would have touched me, or worse, taken me. I'm certain of it. To this day, I still haven't worked out what it was. Has anyone else seen anything like this? Or heard of it? I'd love to know, because I am still in the dark. This encounter took place in the winter of 2016 in Davies County, Indiana. It was around 8 o'clock and very dark outside. I was just out feeding my goats as per my routine. The goat shed was around 300 yards away from my home. To get to the shed, I had to cross 2 small fields and walk along a narrow path through the woods. These woods border an Indiana naval facility. After I had finished, I began to walk back. I had crossed 1 field and was about halfway through the narrow path when I started to hear rustling in the underbrush. All I had with me was a little flashlight that only shined about 10 feet in front of me. I was almost to the end of the path when I spotted something. It was on all fours, with a bony frame, elongated limbs, and pale skin. While the first part of that description sounds pretty generic, it did seem to have a long and highly flexible neck. Not long after I noticed, it seemed to notice me, and bolted down the path. It ran, almost scuttling into the second field. This field had a small hill in the center. This thing fled, and disappeared over one side. I ran as fast as I could around the other side of the small hill, and zigzagged back to my house, where I quickly locked all the doors. This thing was terrifying, but it seemed watchful more than anything, for now at least. I was diving on Koh Tao last month, on a site I've been to before. The descent was fine, very poor visibility, under a meter, and fairly strong currents, but we had heard that there was a whale shark nearby, so we were just swimming around looking for shadows. We went through a narrowish gap in the rocks, single file, and someone ahead stopped. Once I stopped, I felt the current and got pushed sideways into the rock and couldn't see where I was going. I felt something touch my leg, and as I pulled away, it was like 30 bits of tiny Velcro stuck to my leg, and it was being ripped off. I turned around, and all I could see was loads of pink sea anemones, but not the little cute ones you see in Finding Nemo. These things were colossal. I panicked, not knowing what had got to me, and ascended to get above the gap, and got out of the way of everyone to assess my leg. I was coming up in a lot of 1 to 2 centimeter white welts, from halfway up my shin to halfway up my thigh all around my leg. I swam ahead and grabbed my diving master's fin, showed him my leg, and he did the sign for a jellyfish. I shook my head and did the sign for an anemone fish, and drew a house shape with my fingers. Nemo home! He got out his whiteboard and wrote, "Let me know when it gets too bad to continue." This really worried me. How long did I have until the pain was unbearable? How much more painful would it get? Will there be any other symptoms? I stuck to him like glue the rest of the way, an arm's length distance just in case. I completed the dive in a fair amount of pain, but not unbearable. totally amazed by my obvious, incredibly high pain threshold. Back to the boat, my dive master came to check on me with another one, by which point I had 30-ish red blisters covering half of my leg. The other guy just did not believe me that it was an anemone sting. He put his whole face in one and just got tingly lips. Turns out, I'm super allergic. I asked him about the whole when it gets too bad business, but it turns out it was a mistranslation, as he's Dutch. What he really meant to say is if it gets so bad. Good. I was actually shitting myself. The blisters didn't go down for a week, and once I was back in England, I ended up on steroids and antibiotics for a week. And now, I have just 0 pigments where the sting were. So it's almost like a funky reverse tattoo. One of my first experiences doing cave scuba diving, I decided to go dive the cave with my buddy, since we had done it earlier that day when conditions were great. We didn't lay a line either, which was a huge no-no, because there was a pipe along the floor of the cave, which we saw on our previous trip. We assumed this pipe began at the entrance and went straight back into the end of the cave. The owners installed it as a water vacuum to help clean the deepest parts of this cave. This day, there had been a high volume of students diving the cavern, the large open beginning portion of the cave, which had churned up the silt until you could barely see. This is crucial, because the cavern portion is where you just swim towards the sunlight on a normal dive. To add to our screw-ups, we dove in the evening. Not realizing the sun would have set, we begin to dive confidently, trusting in our misguided failsafe, and swam to the cavern. Both of us noticed how silty it was, but figured, hey, you can still see the surface, thanks to the sun, and continued towards the cave. Once inside, we swam down to the end, around 200 meters away, and turned around and began to exit. The closer we got to the exit, the worse the visibility got, and by the time we noticed the light at the end of the tunnel wasn't coming, the visibility was barely 2 feet. Undeterred, we grabbed onto the pipe and followed, hand over hand, to where we assumed the pipe would breach the surface. Crawling along foot by foot, holding onto a PVC pipe on the floor, this was the point where we hit a wall. Literally. The pipe, which we had assumed led to the surface, instead made a bend to a shallower passage of the cave, where it entered the ceiling and disappeared. In this terrible visibility, we followed it into a passage that we'd never seen before, in the part of a cave that was a complete dead end. I'll never forget the feeling of dread and panic that hit me, but the most memorable moment was making eye contact with my buddy as we both realized we were going to die. Most accidental deaths are instantaneous, but in cave diving, you have some time to contemplate your fate as you watch your air pressure needle drop, and panic started to set in. My air needle started moving towards 0, so we fought. Survival instincts set in, and we refused to wait and drown, and instead started crawling in near 0 visibility over every part of that cave to find the exit. There is no sign at the entrance warning people of the dangers of cave diving. It's ironic, but the sign that was outside saved our lives, as it's oriented to face the entrance, a fact my buddy remembered, and gave us a point to try and blindly shoot towards the pitch-black surface. No surprise, it worked. We lived. And 1 month later, I got back on the horse, got cave certified, and was called a lucky idiot by my cave instructor, and learnt to never make the same mistake twice. 2 summers ago, I went to Florida Sea Base for scuba camp. One of the last dives you do is the night dive, where you go to the first reef you dove on, but at night. Now I've been super hyped for this dive, because tons of cool stuff comes out at night. I saw several sea turtles, barracuda, lobsters, eels, and plenty of fish. I even had a squid come about a foot away from me, which was probably the defining moment of the trip. However, in the low-light setting, we couldn't see the hundreds of moon jellyfish floating above us. Moon jellies can sting, but it doesn't hurt too badly. I got stung by them a few other times while surfacing on other dives. I turned to the side to get a better view of the group, and as I was turning back over, a moon jelly somehow got caught in my swim trunks. I had no idea how it happened, but I knew that it had happened as soon as I felt the pain. The jellyfish was stinging up my leg, dangerously close to my crotch, for a solid 10 seconds before my panicked, pain attempts to push it out of my trunk succeeded. I had dealt with plenty of other situations like sharks, lionfish, jellyfish, and common diving mishaps, like masks bumped off, lost regulators and the like, in a cool and collected manner before. But this time, I was just being driven by pain, panic, and fear. I was absolutely terrified of what had happened, and I still had to go through all the jellyfish on the surface with a leg that was swollen and could barely move. I shakingly surfaced at a safe rate with a group and got back to the boat with the assistance of the dive masters. Most of them thought I was exaggerating the sting when I told them what happened. That was, of course, until I showed them my leg. I had this huge reddish rash looking thing all over my leg. I had to soak it in vinegar for the rest of the boat ride, and I hobbed around for the rest of the trip. But it was all worth it, because I saw a squid. It might not have been death or sharks, but dealing with something so painful, from something as insignificant as a moon jellyfish, and knowing I wasn't done yet, was the scariest thing that I have been through. I was on a wreck dive off Oahu, down about 90 feet, with an ex-girlfriend and the owner of a local dive shop. The ex and I are experienced divers, and we were all just messing about, checking out the wreck and the turtles nearby. There had been a group that was on the wreck, but they had left as we descended, so it was just the 3 of us. About halfway into the dive, another person shows up, alone. He got the attention of the dive shop owner, and after furious scribblings on slate, the shop owner came over to us and wrote out, "You both stay down here and finish your dive. I'm taking him up." And then turned to the other dude and gave the guy his octopus regulator to breathe from. We didn't really know what was going on, so we had a perfectly lovely dive, got some good pictures, and ascended as normal. When we got back to the boat, we heard the story. The other guy was from a different boat and had been diving a totally different dive site. He somehow got separated and lost, and had somehow drifted about a mile away from where he went in. There was nothing else around in the direction he was going, except Tahiti, a few thousand miles away. Worst part is, the other guy's boat didn't even realize he was gone and left without him. If that guy hadn't floated past our wreck, I don't know what would have happened. The current pushes you away from land where we were, and since the boat didn't even know he was lost, he would have been floating out there for a long time before someone realized they had a missing diver. I'm a rescue diver in the Bahamas, diving in a submerged blue hole, and a diver went missing. After an hour or two of searching, we went back into the blue hole to see if there were any signs of him, and saw the glint of his watch and his arms sticking out near the bottom. We started descending down to the bottom to recover the body. On the way down, we realized that the bottom was a school of sharks that must have been there for breeding. So many sharks that they blocked the view of the actual bottom. I descended into the darkness, grabbed his arm, as I couldn't stand to look at the body, and started ascending. The sharks followed and were circling the both of us, and I had to take a break halfway around 65 feet in order not to get the bends, and was scared shitless. The entire time, waiting to normalize scared shitless. He was struck by a passing boat. One of my first dives was in shit show conditions. There was a strong current and so much sand debris everywhere that visibility was about 12 inches. For some reason, the dive master was like, "It'll be fine once we get below 40 feet. We started descending on a guide wire, and after getting to about 55 feet, my brother and I, who were dive partners, could not see anyone else in the group. We waited at the bottom for about 10 minutes, and after no one showed up, we started to think that the rest of the group would be waiting on the